You kind of listen some of them. Branko Milanović is also one of the speakers, so maybe you can start with that podcast first. Next to then, we have Professor Mihail Arandarenko from the University of Belgrade, Faculty of Economics. He has published extensively on the issue of labor markets, employment and migration, political economy, social policy, and income distribution, especially in the context of difficult labor markets and socioeconomic transformation in Serbia and Southeast Europe. He was Distinguished Visiting Professor at City University in New York, Academic Visiting Fellow at International Monetary Fund, Senior Visiting Fellow at the London School of Economics, and Postdoctoral Fellow at Collegium Budapest Institute for Advanced Studies. And then finally, our practice is in these kind of events, open conversation, to include students as well, and I'm very happy that we have one of our PhD students, Anica Kovačević, who is a student at our faculty of Political Science at the University of Belgrade, and she's also a researcher at the Institute of European Studies. Her research focused on international economics and political economy, with particular emphasis on US foreign policy and its role in shaping global economic relations. She examines the intersection of economics and international relations, including geoeconomic fragmentation, the strategic use of trade and economic instruments, and shifts in global economic governance. Finally, the star of this event, and global star I would like to add, is our keynote speaker, and that's Professor Branko Milanović. Professor Branko Milanović is a research professor at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He's also senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the same university, and visiting professor at the Institute for International Inequality at the London School of Economics. Milanovic's main aim of work is income inequality in individual countries and globally, including in pre-industrial societies. He has published extensively and numerous articles in top peer-reviewed journals. He is an author of book Global Inequality, A New Approach for the Age of Globalization, which received the Bruno Kreisky Prize and Hans Matthofer Prize. Branko was also awarded for Leontiev Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic knowledge. His Capitalism Alone, also book, was published in 2019 and was translated into 17 languages. His recent book, Visions of Inequality, published in 2023, was awarded by History of Economic Societies Joseph J. Spengler Prize for the best book in history of economic thought in that year. And finally, last year, he published the book, The Great Transformation, book that you can see over there, which is also a reason why we are here. And before we proceed to the lecture, and I know that you're all here to listen to Branko and not myself, I might just want to share one personal story that I told Branko before we started. But many, many moons ago, when I was doing my research on, for my PhD dissertation, I was doing a research on nexus between economic inequalities and violent conflict, and I was doing it in England. And while I was doing my research, someone suggested to me that I should interview the leading scholar on inequality in the world at that moment. And then it turns out that that scholar was Branko Milanović, who was in Oxford at that time. And as every PhD student I wrote, I got, I think, response in 2 minutes. We set kind of an interview, and I just want to mention 2 things. It was an interview in a college where he was very prestigious, also college. And I remember 2 things. First, as every hungry PhD student, I remember cake and tea that was offered there. I still remember that. But more importantly, I remember how rich and thought-provoking discussions I had with Branko, and it kind of really helped me to kind of put forward and kind of my research that I finished my PhD. And I think without this interview and this conversation, it would be very much harder. The point I'm trying to make, that although Branko is doing research on inequality and talks all the time about inequality, he treats everybody in equal intellectual terms. So Branko, I'm happy that I can repay that tea and cookies now. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Nemanja, for this really beautiful introduction. It is, of course, it brought all the memories that he mentioned. It was a good time. We were much younger then. Anyway, it is, of course, a pleasure to be here in Belgrade, as always, and I would like to thank you for inviting me to the European House to give this talk. Let me just see first if the slides are going to work. As Nemanja mentions, the book is actually published just recently, like a couple of weeks ago in the United States. It was published first in England by Penguin, and now it's published by Chicago University Press in the US. The title of the book is obviously being copied. Of course, you would have recognized that from Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi's book was dealing, as you know, was published in 1942, was dealing with the early transition to capitalism in the United Kingdom and social issues that arose from what you might call today sort of an excessive capitalism, introduction of an excessive capitalism, which was not, the famous words, was not embedded in a society. It was a huge transformation, and of course that was the title of Polanyi's book. I think it is not wrong to use the terms that I've used, that today we are witnessing a global, fundamental and global transformation. Now, the transformation, as I was saying, today is taking place at the global level, and that's what is actually the whole idea of the book. The book develops at two different levels, and that's actually why I put this enigmatic title here. I called it the reverse Mandeville. Some of you know that Mandeville, who wrote The Fable of the Beast, actually he wrote that before Adam Smith did the Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations. And the main idea there was the idea that later became famous, that private vices lead to public virtue. The basic idea was that a vice of self-interest and search for profit does lead to an increased income and greater affluence and better relations, but of course it needs to be set within a given framework. So historically, as you know, self-interest was considered a vice, actually, and search for wealth was considered a vice. So the question was, how can vices then become a virtue? In other words, how can vices become something which is very valuable, like greater wealth, affluence, and better relations between people? Now here, why I call it the reverse Mandeville, is for the following reason. We have really two processes, that was at two levels, in the world, that are both linked to the rise of Asia and to rise of China in particular. The first process is that mean incomes between the nations, or if you want to use it, GDP per capita between the nations, have become much more similar than they were 30, 40 years ago. When I ask this question from my students, and I ask them, do you actually think that it's a good thing that incomes between the countries have become more similar? They, of course, all say yes. But then you say, okay, but that means that big countries like China and India and others have become much more similar to the United States in terms of their global importance, and that leads the hegemon, the current hegemon, the United States, to actually oppose and to be afraid of the would-be hegemon of China. So you see a positive development, which is greater equality between nations, and I'm not talking about people here yet, between nations can lead to the conflict. And actually, this is what Anica's topic of her dissertation is, precisely the conflict between the two important poles in the world and how it would work out. The second positive development, which is even more important, and that was something that I've studied for like 30 years, was that global inequality between citizens, like taking 2 billion people in the world now, has also become less than it used to be. Now, of course, inequalities within nation states have increased, have augmented. But because of the rise of China, for the same reason that I mentioned the first problem arose, the second, the rise of China translates into higher incomes of the Chinese citizens. It translates into higher income also, the increase of the rise of India or Indonesia or Vietnam translates into higher incomes of those people. Well, then what happens is that the order by income in the world becomes different than it was. So for the first time in 200 years, the Western income distributions do not take the entire part, and you will see that in a minute, of the top 20%. In other words, to put it very bluntly, and that's what I will show you, middle classes of the West and working classes of the West have now already gone down in the global income ranking. So that positive development of less inequality in the world means that some parts of the world are no longer having the position that they used to have on an individual level in the terms of people's actual incomes. And that, of course, I argue, then in the last part of the book, does produce political turbulence in rich countries. So we have really, once again, we have at two levels, two reasonably good developments, which is equalization of economic power across Eurasian continent, including North America. And on the effects of that are global conflict and political turbulence in rich countries. So basically, that's you get here the whole idea of the book. I could even stop actually talking about the rest of the book because that's essentially the idea. Now, for what the rest is really explaining this idea in greater detail, excuse me, and convincing you that indeed these are really dramatic global developments that have taken place in the last 40 years. I just want to mention that because we live in an era which is absolutely unique. When you look historically, people like me, for example, who were born in the second part of the previous century, believed that that distribution of economic activity was something normal. There was a world of three worlds, the first world, the second world, and the third world. Well, in reality, from the Chinese perspective, and from the long-term 2,000-year at least perspective, or maybe even 4,000-year perspective, this is an anomaly. It actually, the Western importance, which lasted for 2 centuries, was an anomaly, because before the Industrial Revolution, incomes between countries like China, India, UK, or other parts of Europe were very similar. And then during the Industrial Revolution, and after the Industrial Revolution, and all the way to the 1950s or 60s, the gaps became very large. So let me illustrate that. What you see actually on this slide, and I will not go through each individual graph, but the first one, which is on your right-hand side, actually, on the top, shows you the GDP per capita, total GDP per capita, of China versus the United States. It is expressed in purchasing power parity terms. I will not go into the reasons that I actually think that PPP is a better indicator because it actually values all goods and services at the same price wherever they are produced, be it China or the United States or Zambia or whatever. Now, what is interesting here is that 2015 is at the time when China's total GDP in PPP terms overtook the US. So China currently is producing 22% of global GDP, of global output of goods and services. US is producing 16%. Now, this is relatively well known that the Chinese economy is the largest economy in the world in PPP terms. But what people don't often notice is that the same changes have happened between other Asian countries and other Western countries. Now, the next graph on the same side, I just want to point to that one, which is actually striking, is India versus the UK. In 1980, so it is relatively recent, UK and India produced both about 3% of the global GDP. Currently, India is producing 9%, and the UK is producing 2%. So this is a dramatic change, the change which actually is undoing, as you can see, the effects of the Industrial Revolution, which meant that actually the Asian countries became much poorer than the Western countries. The same idea is expressed here. I will not go through all of the slides, but the same idea is expressed here based on Madison's data that Chinese GDP per capita, now we're talking about per capita, was about 40% of the UK GDP per capita in 1820. And as you can see, by 1950, it became 5%. So we have had a dramatic decline, well, actually the dramatic rise of the West and stagnation in Asia. Well, after that, of course, the situation has changed, and as you can see now, China, even under these estimates, which are actually sort of somewhat biased against China, the Madison's estimates, China is now back to the position that it had relative to the UK before the Industrial Revolution. So like another way to look at that is that you can look actually at what was the peak of relative GDP per capita of different countries. What I want to say there is the following. If you look at Asian countries, and the dates are here, you see most of them currently at the historical peak of their income versus the global per capita, average per capita income in the world. Here you see actually, for example, Vietnam, India, China, all have the peak in 2022 or 2023. This is actually the dates when I wrote the book. Now, how does it look for the Western countries? Well, the peak generally was in 1990s or early 2000s. So you see France 2001, Spain 2002. That was their peak relative to the world based on the data going from 1950 until today. The US is really kind of a paradoxical case. The US peak was 1952. So when people from MAGA movement speak of make America great again, it is both makes sense and it's nonsensical. It makes sense because it is true that America is unlikely ever to capture that position that it had in the 1950s. Because you have to think, in the 1950s, you had Europe being destroyed, the powerhouse of Europe, Germany, was destroyed. Rest of Europe was in very bad shape after the war. The Soviet Union had suffered enormously through the war. Japan was bombed out and destroyed. China was in a civil war, and India was colonized. So under these conditions, of course, the US, which actually did very well during the war, had an unprecedented prosperity and unprecedented position in the world in terms of even income of individual Americans. And of course, that since 1952, it has actually declined year after year. But to believe that actually some policies are going to reverse that and to change the order of the world, I think is actually a sort of quixotic development. It just simply will not happen. The 1950s were really a very unique period. So in that sense, the MAGA movement has some meaning, because indeed the position of the United States has declined, but on the other hand, recovering that position means really an entirely different world, which is very unlikely ever to happen. So what does it mean at the level of individuals? So this is now the second level. What it means is that when you look at the global income distribution, like you have it here, mind you, this is the distribution of per capita incomes of individuals, which each country, I have about on average 110 to 120 countries, with incomes by percentile. So the lowest percentile has, let's suppose in Zambia, an income of $2 per day, so on, and lowest percentile in the US would have an income of $25 per day, and so forth. Now, when you do this slide, a graph of the distribution, if you compare 1988 to 2008, to 2018, and actually even have 2023 after the publication of the book, what you notice is that the distribution of the world now, of income in the world across individuals, has a shape of log normal distribution, which is a typical distribution that happens in individual countries. So the world, to some extent, has become sort of one country. And what you also notice is that in the middle, around the median, there are many more people now than was the case in 1988. So the thickness of the middle has really increased very significantly. And that's, of course, where Asia plays the key role. Actually, that thickness in the middle is the rising middle class of Asia. Now, what does this rising middle class of Asia do? It simply displaces the Western lower middle classes and middle classes from their position. I mean, that's a very clear thing. Ordinal rankings by income has changed. Now, let me give you the most dramatic example that I actually like to use, is to compare China with Italy. Now, China, what you see here is that on the horizontal axis, on the abscissa, you have 10 deciles of urban China, from the poorest to the richest. And then you have on the vertical axis, you have their positions in the global income distribution. Now, of course, that line has to go upward because you have the lowest decile as number one. And if you look at the fifth urban decile of China, in 1988, they were around the 50th global percentile. So they were around the global median. Of course, today, that same equivalent individual there would be now at, as you can see there, I think 73rd global percentile. So there was an increase in the position of the Chinese median person. by 23 percentiles or whatever, 25. But what is the second part of that equation? The second part of that equation, as I was saying before, is that the Western middle classes lost their own position. So if I'm at the 73rd percentile Italian in 1988, well, this Chinese is going to overtake me. And that's exactly what you see in the Italian case very dramatically, because it's a country that has not grown at all in 30 years almost. And then, of course, the lower parts of the Italian income distribution, this is the red line, have dramatically declined in their global position. You see that the decline of about 10 to 15 global percentile points. In other words, the bottom of the Western distributions, which used to be relatively highly placed, around the 70th, 80th percentile in the world, has now shifted down by about 5 to 10 percentage points. And that's the same story is obvious for Germany, for the United States, but it's less dramatic because they had actually some real growth, whereas Italy did not have growth. But the China effect, which is then seen at the level of lower parts of the Western income distributions, is seen also in other countries. What is interesting, for example, and I will not go through many of them, just let me mention Brazil. What happens in Brazil is that the bottom of Brazil and the top of Brazil are unaffected by the China effect. Why? Because the bottom has been the poorest in the world in 1988 and is still the poorest in the world among the bottom deciles, bottom percentiles in 2023. The top of Brazil has been among the global top 1% in 1988 and is still in the global top 1%. But who lost in Brazil? The China effect actually moved people in the middle of the income distribution in Brazil or Mexico and Peru down. So depending on where you were, in what country you were, and in what position in that country you were, you felt the China effect more strongly or less strongly. The argument, of course, is that that was this re-ranking of the income positions globally, and the fact that in large countries, very important countries like the US and the UK, the top of their own distributions continued growing while the bottom or the middle did not grow. And that these two things together, I argue, produce the political turbulence that we are witnessing now in the US, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Italy, and in all rich countries. So to conclude, basically, is that you have two effects, both of them, as I said, basically one effect playing out at two different levels. And a priori, we might actually consider them to be good effects, to be actually desirable. But they do produce, at the one level, which is the level of nation states, they produce conflict and they produce the struggle for a multipolar world. That same effect at the level of individuals produces dramatic reshuffling of global income positions and political turbulence in the countries that are affected by that. So here I was just simply rephrasing what I said before, but now with somewhat more data. Let me go back to this. The slide, what illustrates here is that that the top of the global income distribution still remains very heavily dominated by the US. You have about 40% of the people in the top who are Americans. And the reason is the following. America has very specific characteristics. It's a richer country than other Western countries, like the gap between Western Europe and the US is about 30% in mean income. It is very unequal, and it's very large. But being very unequal means that quite a lot of people from the United States are actually in the global top 1%. We're talking about 13% of Americans are part of the global top 1%. But for the first time, we see significant presence of China there. So even at the global top level, we now see the presence of Asian countries. The forthcoming presence of India would be actually quite significant as well. So we are seeing the reshuffling, not as dramatic as in the middle, but we see the reshuffling at the top as well. So finally then, Nemanja, how many minutes do I still have? 10. Well, that's very good. Actually, I was afraid that I was already, but you were very generous probably. You still remember that cake. So let me just sort of go very quickly over the other three chapters. The first one, as I was saying here, is really very empirical. The others are a little bit different. The second chapter asks the following question. Historically, we had many thinkers who actually thought whether openness to trade would lead to peace or to war. The most standard ones that everybody sort of mentions, Montesquieu, who was actually writing before the French Revolution, was the inventor of what is in French called le doux commerce. I mean, technically, sweet commerce, sweet trade. Meaning that trade, by making your income and my income interdependent, leads us to cooperation and actually changes even our behavior. Because if I want to sell you something, I have to be nice to you. I have to convince you that it's good. And you too, if you want to sell me something, you have to be nice to me. So his idea was that in Esprit de Loi, the idea was that commerce would actually lead to peace. Now, that idea, of course, was then used by many other people, like Ivan Bloch in Russia before World War I, and famously Norman Angell in the UK, who argued that war is impossible. That was before World War I, because it really works against interests in capitalists in all countries. So only crazy people would go to war and kill each other and destroy property when they should cooperate and become rich jointly. So that was one view. The opposite view is, of course, the famous Hobson-Luxemburg-Lenin theory of imperialism, where actually trade and competition for foreign markets, more or less what we see now between the US and China in Africa. But that was actually discussed by Hobson in his book Imperialism in 1902, was that the struggle for raw markets, labor, and markets from the raw materials, labor and markets for goods would lead to a conflict between big powers. And so we have here the very opposite view of that. I have only to mention, but I would actually sort of urge you to read, I will not read it out, but Adam Smith has a very interesting middle position between these two and argues that trade would lead, that's actually very interesting in the context of US-Chinese relationships, that trade would lead to equalization of income and technological developments between the trading partners. But that technological development, equality of technological development, would lead to equality, approximate equality in military power. And approximate equality in military power would lead to peace because of the balance of power. Now, notice what is in Smith, the effect of trade is not a direct effect of trade. It's the trade as an engine for technological improvement and military balance. So in Smith's view, trade brings actually peace through military balance, through actually balance of fear between the two competitors. And then I, of course, discussed Schumpeter. I will not go into that, but I wanted simply to show the variety of the ideas about the very simple question. Is trade going to lead us to a world of peace, or is trade going to lead us to a world of war? And then I look at the interpretation of the Sino-American relations from 1949, actually, but especially from after 1972, in the context of these different theories. And I have that I was extremely pleased that several of people who endorsed my book, including Julian Gewirtz, he was actually the chief person on China during the Obama administration in the National Economic Council. And I thought actually I was very pleased that that description, which takes about 15 pages only, of the relations between the Sino-American relations, illustrates to a large extent how the theories apply to different parts. For example, le doux commerce, you can say, applied to the original relations between China and the United States. But in imperial competition applies now. And it's much more complicated because that imperial competition takes place under slightly different circumstances, and maybe I would urge you to read that part of the book because that it talks also about the China trade surpluses, about the fact that China's consumption is very low compared to the GDP, about the power of state-owned enterprises in China, and on the other hand, looks at the American reaction, as you know, the impediments to technological transfers, ban on Chinese IPOs in the United States, and so forth. Then chapter 3 is a different chapter. It really uses work that I've done, empirical work that I've done with several co-authors on the elites in the United States and China. In the United States, and we'll be very brief now, in the United States, the elite has become increasingly very different from it used to be. the elite now combines people who are richest capitalists and richest workers. In other words, among the top 10% of the Americans, you have same people who are in the top of top incomes by capital and by labor. So this is an entirely new development which never existed before, because as you know, in the classical capitalism, the richest people have income from capital, but they are not doubling down as workers, hired workers. But nowadays you can imagine these are professions like software engineers, like doctors, lawyers, and others who have very high labor income and very high capital income. So what then happens is actually really the theory of the elites, I argue, become much more, how should I say, much better in explaining what is currently happening than the class theory. Because class has actually been eliminated, the typical class conflict between labor and capital has been eliminated among the top people, because they're both the richest capitalists and the richest laborers. And then, of course, it has many other ideological implications about the belief in sanctity of private property and so forth, which is maintained by the elite, and the view of meritocracy. And I use quite a lot of work by Daniel Markovits and by Michael Sandel in that meritocracy, the idea of meritocracy, or self-belief in meritocracy. And on China, empirical work with several Chinese authors, we looked at the top 5% of China, urban China, at the elite. What has happened there, I'll just show you, this is my last slide. So I will just show you for the China what is dramatic change in, you see there are lots of slides about the US. So China is a dramatic change in the share of private sector income among the elite. Whereas in 1988, 2/3 of the income at the top came from people who worked in the state-owned enterprises, government, or party administration. Nowadays, 2/3 of income comes from large capitalists, small capitalists, and professional managerial class who work in private companies. So we have a dramatic reshuffling of the top in China. So it's essentially Chinese capitalists are now on the top in China. And finally, in chapter 4, and I will not talk about that now, I apply all of that I've said to the current situation and to the reaction, what I call reaction against the excesses of neoliberalism. And that's where I use this new term for the time that we are living now, which is the subtitle of the book, national market liberalism. The basic idea there is the following, that the general liberal principles, which applied both nationally and internationally, have now been superseded by a new ideology. That ideology remains neoliberal and actually even increases many neoliberal tendencies domestically, while internationally it becomes neo-mercantilistic. So we have something very new, that we have liberalism at home, especially in the economic sphere, and mercantilism abroad. And of course, that mercantilism is seen every day in increased tariffs, coercion, seizure of assets, prevention of trade, prevention of naval movements. We see that actually that nowadays, as many authors have argued, we really see the use of trade as war by other means. And this is the new world, and that's, I think it should have a new name, and that new name is national market liberalism. So we have liberal ideology, which was cosmopolitan, but now it comes with a prefix, national. People say, how can a cosmopolitan internationalist ideology become national? Well, the answer is simple. Socialism was a cosmopolitan ideology. But if you put national in front of this socialism, you get a very different beast from the original one. So, on that very hopeful note, let me finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that amazing keynote lecture. And I will not delay. I would like to ask Dan to miraculously appear on our screen now, and then maybe to provide first comments on Branko's lecture. Dan? Dan, we cannot hear you.
Let me just.
Now we can hear you. Now we can hear you.
You can hear me, so it was not me. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. I am blind. I can't see you guys, but thank you very much. I'm coming to you from sunny Oslo.
Now we can hear you.
It's one of those rare days, and I wish I was there with you in person. I have very fond memories of being at this particular venue, Europe House, last year, where we did an event. So I can visualize, I'm recreating that scene by standing in my basement and pretending that I'm with you, Nemanja and Branko. So thank you very much for this invitation. It's always such a pleasure to listen to the one and only Branko. I mean, he is just simply brilliant, churning out one book after another. And I don't know, Branko, maybe you have some advice for us how productive we all can be if we could somehow emulate you. I'm also very, very grateful to Nemanja and the whole Circle U team, Milos and Nikola, for organizing this event. And I wish I could join you for the wonderful dinner that you're surely going to have, because Belgrade has some of the best restaurants in the world. Okay, so
I'm sorry to interrupt
it would be an understatement to say that I really enjoyed listening to the talk, and there are lots and lots of things that Branko has touched on. I'm told now 4.5 minutes, so I'll be quick. What we what I found particularly compelling is, of course, in Branko's presentation, is that he's capturing something truly historic. We are looking at a major reordering of the world economy, and particularly the rise of Asia. And I noticed the term, Branko, that you use, the reshuffling. I think that really is key, because it's the reshuffling of global income positions and the emergence of what we might call a so-called global middle. Now, let me offer two brief reflections, given the time constraints, on this key question before us. And the key question here is, how do democratic societies confront this rising inequality without undermining political freedoms, or, end up drifting towards authoritarianism? The 2 points. The first one I want to emphasize is this tension between crisis talk and possibility talk. And the reason I mention this is that, one of the reasons I could not come is because we have organized today a major conference on democracy here at the University of Oslo. And unsurprisingly, most of the talk was about, democratic regression in the United States. And not just in the US, but also in Europe, in parts of the global north, we see this doom and gloom scenario. What are we going to do? The whole order that we've created has collapsed. And what about our position? What about American exceptionalism? We were destined to be great. We are supposed to be number one. There is this fear of being left out. But that is not what I see in the global south. I don't hear that in Beijing. I don't hear that in Delhi. I don't hear this in South Africa. There I see or hear much more talk about possibility. And Branko, our common friend, Yuan Ang, has been talking about, the distinction between polycrises, these multiple crises, and polytunity, or the multiple opportunities. I prefer to use the term possibility because we are in many ways in this interregnum, this period between two world orders, and what we now see is, the world split. As much as, Branko, you're arguing for this convergence, I also see within these societies this fear that there is crisis in the global north and much more possibility in the global south. Whatever the next order is, what is certain is that it has to be more fair, because it is not perceived, at least the old order or the current one, however you term it, is not perceived to be legitimate. And so any next sort of global order has to have active inclusion of the global south. So that's the first point. The second one, and because this is a Circle U event, organized by the Democracy Hub, I really think we should highlight the fact that we perhaps need to make democracy more fit for purpose. At least that is the tone in many, many debates in our parts of the world. And I'm sure the audience, you will have heard, at least some of you, some of the recent reports by the VDEM, Democracy Project at the University of Gothenburg. It has actually painted a very bleak picture because it shows that the share of the world's population now living in liberal democracies has fallen actually from 17% in 2005 to just 7% in 2025. And then we have, at the same time, and please note, 3.4 billion people living now in countries that are autocratizing. And the big challenge is freedom of expression, that is often, frequently attacked, and media censorship. So this is often, resulted in this democratic erosion. But again, I want us to balance the picture. I don't think we should despair. There are actually lots of countries that have remained stable democracies, and we should be proud of that. And this is not just in Latin America or Europe, it's also in many parts of Asia and Africa. But what I think is crucial to understand, and this goes back to some of the arguments that I think Branko was making, at least my understanding of it, is that while lots of people in large parts of the world may support, at least in principle, a democracy, they are, in Africa, repeated surveys by Afrobarometer, but also in Asia, it seems that democracy does not lead to greater satisfaction. So people support democracy, but they're less satisfied with what democracy has brought them. So it is in that sense that I think we have to make democracy work better, to promote development, more jobs, better paying jobs, higher quality jobs, decent work. These are things that democracy has to deliver more rapidly. So while democracies must prove that they are effective, we have to also worry that, we can't have a situation where because development is not being provided, social protection is not being provided, that we'll end up in some form of repression or democratic regression. So the way for democracies to confront this rising inequality is, I think, not to choose between equality and freedom, but to show real security, real mobility, real dignity that depends on both equality and freedom. And in many, and this is my last sort of point, in many Western democracies, as Branko mentioned, and, parts of the middle class, particularly in the US, I'm told that now there's a situation where most families, even with two incomes, they can't afford to send their kids to college, which was not the case in the 50s and 60s. So you have in Europe, in the United States, parts of the middle class that do not, feel secure in the way they once did. And that insecurity has been redirected often to nationalism, scapegoating, democratic fatigue. And this is where I think the broader geopolitical setting that Branko was alluding to with the rise of Indias and the Chinas is important, because we have to, I mentioned earlier that we are between two world orders, the interregnum. We have to accept that the US-led, the Western-led liberal international order is now more fractured than it has ever been since the Cold War. It has never really been very legitimate. It hasn't really been fair to large parts of the world, but we are now seeing the rise of the global South. We are seeing greater demands. And what is also a bit worrisome, of course, is that nationalism is proving to be more powerfully political than globalism. And that is why the future of the world order itself feels to many people to be deeply uncertain. So what we need to acknowledge, in my view, is that, particularly in the global north, is that while the world economy is changing, prosperity is being redistributed globally, that this is not in itself a problem. This should not be seen as a problem. The real challenge is where governments can actually help their own citizens adapt fairly to these shifts through investments, through inclusion, through institutional competence, rather than through what I often see around us, fear-based politics. So, in conclusion, what I suppose I'm advocating for, Branko, Nemanja, and everybody who's there in Europe House today, is more a politics of hope. Thank you very much. And I'm assuming that you were able to see and hear me.
Thank you, Dan. I think you said you were blind, but hopefully you heard our applause. Thank you so much for your great points, and I'm sure maybe Branko will reflect on some of them in a Q&A maybe after we... Yeah. Thank you, Dan, once again, and hopefully we'll see you soon in Belgrade. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. I think you said you were... Now I will go to our second panelist, Professor Arandarenko, who will also hopefully give also more optimist spin on this. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Of course, I'm very pleased, and thank you, Nemanja, for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to discuss Branko's new book, and it happens quite regularly right now, and I hope there will be many more to come. I will maybe have only two remarks, two topics that I would like to address. The first one would be more like, anticipating what might be something that interest the audience here. Where would be the place of Serbia in that reshuffling? And, my tentative answer, but then perhaps Branko might comment on that, would be, it's not great, but not really bad. So Serbia is a part of a declining, in relative terms, region of Europe, but at the same time, it grows a little bit faster than Europe. So, somehow we will probably keep that middle position in the world economic order. And then the second topic is related to homoplutia. Branko mentioned already this really new concept for a really new phenomenon, and I simply think it is really important, precisely because the role of new elites, which are homoplutic, and the term is the one that Branko invented, actually, is really something that will only get in importance. And this is the area where Branko has done really path-breaking research, both conceptually and empirically, in several recent works. So what is the novelty? Again, the novelty of this concept is that people are, that the elite members, let's say top 10%, and especially top 1% of modern democratic societies like US and other Western countries, are at the same time labor rich, having high salaries, and capital rich, having, of course, high capital incomes. And this is perhaps only the case in the past, of any significance in the past 50 years or so. It comes with the rise of neoliberalism, and actually, if we think throughout the human history, people escaped hunger for most of the human history by working. And then they wanted to escape work by amassing wealth. And now they're somehow reverting that. Those who amass wealth go back to work, and even, as a side effect, also sometimes hunger themselves if it expands their life. So that's how this new phenomenon actually came to becoming so important. It goes with the rise of neoliberalism. Basically, the post-war development was such that in the US and elsewhere, tax rates were high, income tax rates were high, and capital tax rates were high. So this was somehow, preventing the formation of those homoplutic elites. Actually, the rise of neoliberalism with Reagan and Thatcher and others in the 80s was first a defensive event, meaning, neoliberal economists basically advocated for liberalization, for deregulation, and it involved, of course, decreasing taxes and more liberal capital, access to capital, and higher profit rates, basically, and higher profits, and reshuffling between labor and capital in favor of capital. And this was the defensive phase. And then in the 90s, there was an exuberance, the defeat of socialism, the end of history, if you like. And then again, the role of economists should not be underestimated. In basically, this is well documented in Piketty's book, the need to basically increase managerial incomes as much as possible. Another type of reshuffling between labor and capital in that area. But then somehow, with the new millennium, actually brought the increase in that homoploutic class, both because those who were capital rich thought that it is very good to be also labor rich, and then on the other hand, those who were labor rich were in a way enabled to become capital rich because of very high incomes that were propagated and that they were able to acquire. And so in that sense, now we have like 30% of American top 10% who are at the same time have high capital income and high labor income. And it is like fortifying, or this is what is the major fear, that this might fortify their dominant role in American economy and society and politics. And now what would be that's my question, what would be the ways to basically to get the brakes to greed, as you put it in your 5th chapter? There are two basically, typical recommendations. One would be get back to very high taxes, both on income and capital. Inheritance tax, that's a part of that first package. And the second package would be also democratize the ownership. And again, I know that you've been, going from one from one recommendation to another, because it's really difficult to break this. But basically, if you can comment on that.
Thank you. Branko, I suggest we finish with the panelists and then you can have a reflection round, yes. And then finally, last but not the least, definitely is our, as I said, our PhD student, Anica Kovačević, and she will give us her impression of the book and Branko lecture, and maybe some of her own point from her own ongoing research. Anica, the floor is yours.
Work? Perfect. Hello one more time. Thank you, Professor. It's a great honor to be part of this conversation and to speak after Professor Milanović. I have to admit that I'm a bit nervous. It's quite a big deal for me. And I have just arrived from the United States. And as a good student, when I find out that Professor is going to talk about his new book, I decided to buy one. And actually, it's quite a lovely cover, different from this, but also, as I said, one very important book for all of us. And when I start reading, I realized, okay, this book is one of the perfect, and I'm really going to use it for my PhD thesis. Still have to find out how, but first of all, I'm talking about change of global international order. So, about this discussion and presentation, what I find especially important in Professor's argument is that story of inequality today is not just about income gaps. We are always talking about income gaps. It's quite important. We have to find out how is it up to Serbia, how is it up to other country. But what's important, it's not just income gaps. This book and this topic is also about changes in power, shifts in political confidence, and the structure of the global order. And as we all know, Professor has mentioned that for a long time, globalization was presented as a process that would bring such a kind of prosperity, wide power, and in one way, also, maybe it's going to produce a change in income. How is it going to be redistribution? And really it did. If we look at China, it was a great shift. And that process also brings such kind of good things. But on the other side, it brought new tensions. And actually, Professor mentioned that how West is looking to China and on China growth, especially. So there, I find out that we really have one paradox. And that one is the process, globalization, is a process that helped reduce inequality between countries, but also at the same time, it contributes to political stress within them. And we are facing actually that time. So in that sense, we can say that global convergence did not simply produce harmony. It also produced vulnerability and new political reactions. So when I believe here, I can see a lot of my colleagues, students, and I believe that all of us, not just them, but me and you, here, all of us, we know how does it feel when large part of society feel that growth is uneven, the gains are concentrated at the top or at such a kind of elite, or that maybe our future is less stable than before. And this is not just an economic issue. It becomes a political one. And it also affects trust in institutions, trust in elites, and trust in promise that democratic system can still deliver fairness and security for all of us, wherever we are. And today's lecture reminds us that inequality today cannot be separated from geopolitics. And actually, that's what Professor mentioned. It's going to be one of my topics about geopolitics. And we talked a lot about the rise of Asia. And I really think that this is not just one, let's say, like in a business talk, like just one story about how Asia grows economically. It's quite important, but it's something more than just one economic story. It's a story about redistribution of global power. And we can say it now, US is still the great power, but where is China? Is it maybe a threat for US? And really, trust me, I talk with a lot of people from United States, from administration, and they said, yes, China is a threat. And we are in competition with them. Who is going to win? We still have no idea. We might see it in the next few years, in the next decades, but that competition is ongoing. And for that reason, I find Professor's idea of national market liberalism in a multipolar world especially important. For me, if I get it quite well, it captures a world in which markets still matter deeply, but no longer operate within the old confidence of liberal globalization. So as a result now, what do we have, and actually where do we live? States are now much more willing to intervene, to protect, compete, and also to think in terms of national interest. And particularly, I would like to emphasize example of United States. I think that it's quite hard to count how many times Donald Trump used to say, I'm going to put America first. I'm going to make America great again. And actually, that's the point of national interest. So this issue is no longer only how wealth is created, but also how economic relations are shaped by power. And I think I'm doing research for my PhD, not so for a very long time, but I find out a new term, a new phrase. It's globalization 2.0. And I know that some of you heard about that point. And actually, what is it about? I really believe that we live in such a kind of new globalization. There is still there. People say, no, now it's coming to deglobalization, globalization is unprocessed, neoliberalism is dead. There are different stories. It might be not or yes. But I honestly believe that we are living in a new way of globalization. And we do not have deglobalization, but more reorganization of globalization. So it's like a new kind of globalization. And actually, if we compare it with the previous one, and it was not so long time ago, what changed from that time is actually organizing question. So at that moment, the organizing question was, who produces most cheaply? In these days, in the last few years, what do we have in that new kind of globalization? The main question, whose production can we rely on when geopolitical pressure rises? And actually, in that question, we can find answer on these moments, what's happening all around the world, why do we have all of these wars, and actually what's the interest of the great powers. So, from that shift to efficiency to trust, I believe that a great example, and just want to point out in short, it's going to be example of relationship between United States and China. As we can see, trade, technology, and production are now deeply tied to geopolitical competition. So economic change is no longer discussed only through the language of efficiency or growth. It's discussed in terms of power, vulnerability, and strategic dependence. So now, what do we have, if I'm quite right? Markets are still central, of course, it's no matter. But they're no longer seen as separate from politics. Maybe they've never been. They're always, walking a line like, okay, we are together. There is no political decision without economic interest one. I believe it is actually quite right. But therefore, one of the main takeaways from today's discussion, and I believe it is this, inequality matters not only because it affects living standards, that's true, but because it also shapes how societies see themselves and how the citizens relate to political institutions, and how state, our or any other, respond to change in a more competitive world. So this discussion about inequality is so important because we are not talking just about distribution, how income is distributed. It's a great one, we have talked a lot about it, but what's the point here? And I believe, actually, when I heard all professors, we are talking about democratic, about legitimacy, stability, and about the future of democracy in a world marked at the same time by inequality, geopolitical rivalry, and changing global order. And next to that, for the end, I have one small question for Professor Milanović. What do you think about Africa? I know you wrote it in your book, but I want to ask you personally, what do you think? Is it quite possible that maybe Africa, in a future, next few decades, or who knows, might be China too, in his model? So, thank you.
Thank you, Anica. As someone who works at the Faculty of Political Science, I'm very happy that Anica made a connection with the politics all the time. And maybe just to finish, before I give floor again to Branko, there is one Chinese artist who, and I'm going to paraphrase, who said, politics is everything, everything is politics. So I think this is a kind of sums up very nicely what you made as well. So Branko, do you want to reflect maybe on that, and then we can take some questions from the audience as well?
Well, first, I would really like to thank the panelists for really excellent comments and excellent questions, and very sort of, how should I say, which provoke you to sort of think more deeply. Now, let me try to sort of answer very briefly each of the panelists. I think Dan made 2 points. One was the point that the globalization, the current situation in the world, or the new world order, is perceived very differently in the global south from the global north. I think everybody who travels to the global south knows that, actually, and you look at the statistical surveys, you look at actually Vietnam is the country with the highest approval of globalization when you ask that question. And France is the lowest. So it is definitely true, but it is true because what my book argues, empirically, the Western incomes have now declined in their global ranking for the first time in 200 years. So we have a global transformation. Actually, Dan mentioned this term that actually I use, reshuffling, and it is a huge reshuffling. Several years ago, I was in a similar panel discussion with Paul Collier, who was a professor at Oxford working on Africa and wrote, he was also in the World Bank, the chief economist, and did a book which is called The Future of Capitalism. And in that book, he has this sentence saying how UK has actually, the policies have been wrong, everything is wrong and so on, and how it used to be that an Englishman or a Briton would walk to different parts of the world and would feel really high and important. And I said, well, yes, but then the other people felt small. So you felt high and the others felt small. Well, now the situation is different. So I think it is that was the first point that I think Dan made, is I fully agree with that the perception of globalization is different in two parts of the world, but it's different because objective circumstances have changed for one side and the other side. Now, the second point was about democracy, and I have to say that the book really is not very much normative at all. I'm observing the developments. I'm in principle in favor of democracy, but, you know, there are many issues there. The situation is not so simple. There are, of course, trade-offs. Actually, Dan mentioned the trade-off between equality and democracy. There is a trade-off between growth and democracy, which actually illustrates the Chinese issue. China has so far had very little soft power, but it doesn't mean that it would continue like that. And that the trade-off between democracy and growth is quite evident in the case of China. So that was the second point, is really that there is not that much normative stuff in the book. Then Misha's question on Serbia, I should have actually had that slide. Serbia, every decile has declined. So it's very simple. But the deciles that have declined the most are, like elsewhere in Eastern and Western Europe, are the bottom deciles. So the top deciles stayed more or less where they were. I think it was like 87 or 90th percentile. And everybody else, of course, and they also declined by several points, but the decline was actually steeper for the lower. So the China effect or Asia effect is very present here. You know, interesting case is Poland, most successful European transition country by far, with Estonia. Well, what is interesting in the Polish case, and I presented this stuff because it's my earlier work, I presented in Poland, and people cannot believe. Actually, the bottom half of the distribution was better off, globally speaking and ranking, in 1988 than now. I said, like, wow, we were better under, you know, Gierek than, or who was that? Jaruzelski was, Jaruzelski, than now. Well, yes, because then everybody in Asia was below you, and now some of them are ahead of you. Now, the top of Poland, the top 5 deciles are now better off than they were in 1988. So it's a very interesting thing for Poland, the successful case of transition. The second question, then Misha, of course, discussed homoploutia. I have to mention that Misha, I know he knows Greek, so he didn't need to sort of translate for you the term. Homo means the same, and plutia means wealth. So the idea of this new term that I coined was to indicate that the new elite is wealthy in both factors of production, in capital and labor. And that, of course, as Misha was saying, is an entirely new development. I think I mentioned that I think that's the only development in modern capitalism that Marx would have been surprised with. I think everything else he would have actually sort of understand. But this development, which eliminates the class conflict at the top among the same individuals, is something really that is entirely new. And we see that it has increased in the US, and we see also that in countries of classical capitalism, like Brazil, Mexico, Peru, that portion of the elite, homoploutic elite, is very small. And in Eastern Europe, it's also very small. So it's really in the developed capitalist countries that it's very high. And finally, on Anica's excellent comments, I totally agree. I think you made the key point there, is that essentially power relations nowadays matter, and national interest is openly displayed and out there. And in that respect, of course, many people see similarities between today's conditions and pre-World War I conditions. And that's why I think that Hobson, Luxemburg, that's Rosa Luxemburg, and Lenin's sort of theory of imperialism has many, how should I say, attractive features in explaining today's world. And of course, people have already used it quite significantly, and I mentioned before the role of China, the competition between China and the United States in Africa for the resources, even the current war. I'm not going to talk about the current war, but you can actually see this war as essentially a conflict between China and the US being played out through the Middle East and Iran. And on Africa, Africa doesn't play much of a role in the book, absolutely. And you know what, people like me who have worked in global income distribution for 30 years, Africa just doesn't play a role. It's actually, they used to be poor, they remain poor, and they don't affect the overall global distribution. However, that is now going to change, and it is changing, because China is no longer a country that would automatically reduce global income inequality, because China has now become too rich. So if it grows very fast, it gets further away from Africa. And Africa, we should not speak actually of Africa as Africa, we should speak of really large countries, which are all around 100 and more million people, like Ethiopia, Sudan, Nigeria, Congo. These countries, if they do not catch up and don't become China 2.0, the global inequality will go up. And actually, we already see that. If Africa does not converge, we will have an increase in global inequality. That's actually basically inevitable. So the question is actually, will Africa converge? And that also raises many other questions that I only briefly mentioned and that you all know. That's the question of migration in Europe. Europe with declining population and very resistant to increased migration. So you have here a recipe for low growth in Europe, further decline of Europe, and also inability of Africa to export people.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions. So if you can please raise a hand and then state your name and then ask a question. Yes, please. Yeah.
Better with the mic. Hi, Professor. Thank you to everyone at the panel. I just felt it would be a pity for the youth in the audience not to receive a different perspective on relevant geopolitical matters, which are not perhaps relevant or known here due to their lackluster appearances or mentions. So it has come to my attention that ever since the 1960s, it has been perceived that the Western world is living in a sort of a knowledge economy, and that the knowledge economy disparity in the West and the other, let's say, less fortunate parts of the world has brought forth microeconomic and institutional disparity as well, where we find ourselves with individuals who, in the example of our own nation, are tormented by wars that happened in the recent years and that thus have been left disillusioned in the value of knowledge, and as a consequence they remain lagging behind on our European and US counterparts in terms of both expertise and the ability to actively participate in the labor market, thus positioning us stronger. After this observation and perhaps an obvious example of Singapore as a nation which turned this around positively, would you be ever so kind to perhaps advise us on how to approach this and then tip the point to our benefit? Thank you.
Maybe one more?
Go like one by one because I'll be very quick. First of all, I will use this question actually to answer Misha's question that I didn't fully. I simply, when Misha talked about these different ways of actually fighting homoplutia, one of them is, of course, spreading capital ownership throughout the distribution. That was the Margaret Thatcher idea, which didn't pan out. And it's not very easy at all. The other way is actually to really start taxing them very heavily, and what I called actually, I like this pedagogical tax. I think actually if they want to get involved in, for example, owning the media or supporting different politicians, you say, okay, that's excellent, but you pay $4 billion for owning the Washington Post, okay? And you have to actually have an exorbitant taxation of them for any involvement in, I believe, in NGOs, in politics, in political campaigns, and in ownership of the media. So that was the question. The second one on Singapore and knowledge economy, really, I mean, we are all in favor of that. I don't have a sort of a matrix or a solution how that should be applied, but I like the fact that you mentioned Singapore. Singapore is yet another example of a trade-off between democracy and growth.
Thank you. Any other question maybe from the audience? Yes, all the way in the back. So the mic is coming, don't worry.
so much. I was wondering if you could please just elaborate a little bit more on the development that would make Marx surprised. And why is it that it is actually happening in the developed countries? What is specific about that? Thank you.
You know, why would Marx be surprised? Because if you look at the income distribution of classical capitalism, empirically actually, if you look at the Germany, we now have all this data, you know, for German income distribution, British income distribution in 1850, 1890s, 1910, and all of that. What do you find? You find, of course, that the top 10% or 5% or whatever, 1%, was composed of people who either had land assets or people who had assets which are financial or physical capital. As Misha was saying, 99% of other people, they had to work to survive. So we had hired labor. And what would surprise Marx is that actually people who are hired labor, which of course all these fancy professions that I mentioned are, technically, they are hired labor, they are now in a position where they not only are at the top of the income distribution, but they are at the same time, in the same persona, they are also rich as capitalists. You know, when you look at the classical capitalism, if there is a large classical capitalism, if there is a large capitalist and a large landowner, they are owning 100%, practically 90% of their income they're receiving from the ownership of assets. We now have a situation that people are at the same time receiving income, large income from ownership of assets and continuing working. Actually, and then of course there are many other things there which I will not go into that. It creates a specific culture, and that was this culture which has been now very severely criticized in the United States, because that was the culture of meritocracy, which uses what Daniel Markovits calls the old-fashioned virtues, by saying that essentially, or believing that people who have not been as successful, they have not been as successful because they were lazy or they were not intelligent. Consequently, they dismiss the less successful people, and they dismiss lower middle class, and they have different culture, and that, of course, you can argue led to the political outcomes that we have seen.
Maybe we have time for one more question, so if there is anyone else who would like to ask, I think this is the right moment to do it.
I think everything was so clear.
Yes. If not, I would just like to finish with, first of all, I'm very thankful that Branko found the time to come to Belgrade, because he came only for a day or two, and I think here in Serbia, for our last couple of years, we have been preoccupied with ourselves and the problems that we have here, but the world didn't stop. The world keeps spinning, and has, as my panelists very nicely put, globalize and reshuffles, and I think it was very nice from Branko to come and to remind us all of this, to be mindful whenever internally we solve our issues, we still are part of this world, and we need to compete with others, and hope will be some next, you know, like to be on the other spectrum of this battle that is going on in income distribution. So Branko, thank you very much, and thanks to panelists for amazing lecture.
Thank you a lot. It was really